So without further ado, I would love to introduce today's speaker. I think we're so lucky to have her. So this session will be delivered by Karen Hangartner, who is the Director of Professional Services at the National Children's Advocacy Centre in the USA. So the National Children's Advocacy Centre is the first children's advocacy centre in the world. And if people kind of know their Bairns history, the Bairns model was based initially on the Children's Advocacy Centre. So Karen is an experienced trainer, director and leader, and driven by passion and loyalty, Karen has served the CAC movement for more than 20 years. She's delivered hundreds of trainings nationally and internationally. Karen deeply believes that the CAC model is not only vital to a healthy community, but has the power to fundamentally change our country and our world. And I think that's something we believe here strongly as well. Karen leads a professional services department by casting strategic division and ideation that improves services and effectiveness at the National Centre. She keeps up to date with the ever-evolving CAC model to ensure all the services delivered are firmly grounded in research and data. So today, Karen will be exploring the common barriers that impact multi-agency team functioning at that kind of structural level and discuss strategies to overcome those barriers. And she'll be taking learning from the American Children Advocacy Centre in the US. And for people that don't know, the Children's Advocacy Centre is almost like a franchise model. So each CAC is different rather than having kind of one set model. It's all based on a set of national standards, which is really similar to sort of what we're developing in Scotland. So we're really, really lucky to have you. So Karen, over to you. Go for it.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. I really appreciate that. And I'm thrilled to be with you guys. I've only been to Scotland once in my lifetime, but one of my favorite places, y'all probably don't want to hear this at all, but Outlander is one of my favorite shows in the world. So everything I know about Scotland, I think I've learned from Outlander, as well as my one trip. So I am thrilled to be with you guys. And I told them it's really odd right now as an American to be in an international space. So I will just say that the majority of Americans, I don't think, are necessarily representative of what our American government is doing right now. So I'll just leave that there. But I am excited to be with you guys to talk about this model of responding to child abuse, which has been really a passion of mine for more than 20 years now. And so I just thought I would start with just a little bit about the National Children's Advocacy Center and about who we are. So in a lot of ways, we are like any other local working children's advocacy center in the world. We provide local services to children in our county within the state of Alabama. And so we do forensic interviews, we do medical exams, we provide mental health services, victim advocacy, we have a lot of prevention programming, and our multidisciplinary team, our law enforcement, CPS, prosecutors are located here, co-located here on our campus with us. And then in the international space, we actually do quite a bit of training on forensic interviewing as well as multidisciplinary team response and, working with multidisciplinary teams to really kind of create this multi-agency response to child abuse. We have the Calio, which is the Child Abuse Library online, which if you're not familiar with that, it has just over almost 7,000 items in there that help support child abuse professionals, really kind of linking that research to practice piece so that what we're doing is always informed by the latest research around the work that we're doing. We have a virtual training center as well, which provides free training for folks that's available. We also have the Southern Regional Children's Advocacy Center, which is a federal grant. But what that uniquely positions us to do is I directed that project for a number of years. And what it means is that we work a lot with the state chapter organizations. All 50 states have a chapter organization that kind of oversees the CACs in that state, and gives us access to really boots on the ground, what's happening with multidisciplinary teams across the U.S. And then we also are trained in a model called CSERT, and we provide training around that, which is really kind of a response to secondary traumatic stress. So those are some of the things that we do nationally and internationally in the training that we do. Just for your information, here's what the national structure in the U.S. looks like for CACs. You do have the regional children's advocacy centers, which we hold one of those, and we provide training and technical assistance completely free of charge to state chapter organizations, as well as CACs and MDTs in that area. And in the southern region, we have about 44% of all the CACs in the country are in the southern region. And then there are state chapter organizations. All 50 states have a chapter organization. They do a lot of, it's interesting to look at and see how state chapters have evolved over the 20 years that, or more than 20 years that I've been in the field, that they provide support, some training and technical assistance to the CACs in their state. They really do a lot of work around state legislation that helps support the CAC work in that state. Our chapters in the southern region are some of the most, as a collective, most sophisticated chapters in the US. And so they're actually moving more into a monitoring kind of space for their CACs, because they are passing through so much money nowadays to their CACs. And then the National Children's Alliance is the membership organization. It's actually started here as the National Network of CACs, and moved to DC because we knew we needed a presence, a national presence in DC. And so they are the membership organization. When you hear us talk about standards, they set the standards for children's advocacy centers. It's important to note that those are minimal standards. They are not best practices per se. And so they provide a lot of mental health training too that they've started doing, and they also have a couple of lobbyists, a lobbyist on staff, and they contract with a lobbyist too to make sure that in the federal legislation we're getting the legislation that we need to support the work of children's advocacy centers. And then you have NCAC, the National Children's Advocacy Center. We were the very first CAC in the world. We provide a lot of training nationally and internationally. I really do think one of the places that we excel is that really translating that research into practice. So the research is telling us this. What does that mean for the victim advocate on the ground or the forensic interviewer on the ground in the CAC? We really do promote best practices specifically around, I think, multidisciplinary teams and forensic interviewing. And we have 2 big federal grants that really put us in a unique position to have a really good feel for what's happening with CACs across the country. And then our international work really helps us have an idea of what's happening with CACs all across the world, which is really fascinating. And so this is kind of a breakdown of the regional children's advocacy centers. And I only show this to you to say the red is all the places that we serve. So it's about 44% of all the CACs in the country, and it's a third of all the state chapters in the country. These are US Census regions. So, and I say that to say it just gives us unique access to the many different ways that this model plays out across the country and internationally. So how did this movement get started? What was the problem we were trying to solve when the first CAC in the world opened? And so what happened was Bud Kramer, who was then the elected district attorney in Madison County, Alabama, he went on to become a federal congressman. But he was the prosecutor, and he had an angry grandmother walk into his office and say, this process, my grandchild disclosed the sexual abuse that had happened to her, and going through that disclosure and the process that she had to go through, that's been more harmful for her than the actual abuse was. And so Bud Kramer at that point was like, okay, we got to figure out something different. So what this would have looked about in the early 1980s was, that child disclosed abuse. And so prosecutor, law enforcement, and maybe child protective services would have been involved in this. It would have been involved in this process. But there was no medical, no mental health, no victim advocacy. know how to talk to kids, to get information from them in a way that would be, would held up in our courts. And so we didn't have forensic interview models back in the early 80s when this started. And so by 1984, when Bud Kramer says we've got to figure out a better way to do this, and so he developed a task force, and they went all over the country looking for what are other communities doing to respond to child abuse in their communities. And so by 1984, we were looking at, here's all the people that need to be involved in this. All of these people touch these cases in some form or fashion. And so how do we get all of these people around a table in the same room to talk about what this kid and family needs? But we still didn't have forensic interview models in 1984. Those didn't exist yet, not to mention a whole body of evidence around forensic interviewing that we have now in 2025 that just did not exist even when the first CAC opened. And so this is the picture of the very first CAC in the world. We call it the Little House. It's still in existence. And I can remember one time because by the time I started at NCAC, almost 21 years ago now, 22 years ago now, something like that, I remember we were in multiple places. So there were some people that were in a big, office building downtown, but the clinical services, the forensic interviews, the therapy services, all of that happened in this little house. And I can remember one time the receptionist saying, yeah, it's a good day when my desk doesn't fall further through the floor. So they always knew that, from this very first CAC, we wanted to move to this place. So 40 years later, we have a 5-building campus. Our multidisciplinary team is co-located on our campus. They have their own building, as a matter of fact. There are almost, 1,000 CACs in the U.S. and CAC models like, Hoose or whatever they're called in whatever country they are, in over 40 countries. So it was amazing. We have an international conference every year in March, and so we just had it about 2 or 3 weeks ago. We had 16 different countries represented at our international our conference. So it is quite amazing to see how the model is spreading. And so it seems like this should be pretty easy, right? Have you ever met anybody that says we don't want to do good work on behalf of kids and families? No, you've never met anybody who would ever say, no, I don't care about kids. I don't want to help kids. But man, so when we think about doing this, it actually is not quite as easy as it seems. And so before there were CACs, it really was kind of this agency-centered approach. So any agency that was involved in working these cases, prosecuting these cases, investigating these cases, serving the kids and family, they're really looking at, what do I need from this kid and family to make my case? And so, what does my case, my agency need from this kid and family? And so that's why before there were CACs, a kid would talk to somebody from law enforcement, somebody from prosecution, somebody from child welfare, maybe, hopefully somewhere along the line, somebody from mental health, somebody from medical. But it was really more about, I'm a police investigator. I need information to make my case. What do I need from this kid and family to be able to get that? And so really what the CAC model did was it kind of shifted everything on its axis. And it's like, number one, how do we go about doing our jobs without causing additional trauma for this family? Because remember that angry grandmother that walked into Bud Kramer's office back in the early 80s was like, the system itself has harmed my child more than the abuse itself. And so how do we go about recreating a system that doesn't cause additional trauma for this kid and this family? And then also, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but it's pretty common in the US. How do we go about completing our investigations without stepping on each other's cases? Timelines are a big thing in the US. CPS has so many hours that they have to lay eyes and talk to a kid. usually law enforcement's not quite ready to, they're trying to make their case in the background. So how do we coordinate our efforts in a way that we don't necessarily put the case in jeopardy for other agencies that have a place in this or have a role in this? And then what does this kid and family need from this community, this group of committed professionals, to be able to really thrive in light of a case, an allegation of child abuse? And I think it's just amazing to me now that back in the early 80s, we didn't necessarily have any research around child trauma, really nothing. And so now we know so much more about what kids need to thrive in the face of abuse. And we were trauma informed before we ever heard the term trauma informed. The CAC model was. And so essentially what we're doing is taking this complex system that looks like any huge multi-lane highway system, from this complex thing where people are off-boarding, on-ramping, off-ramping. It's just a maze of mess. And we're trying to make it like this for kids and families, so they feel like this is a simple process. I know where we're going, and somebody's actually going to walk me through every step of the way. I have somebody that's going to advocate for me, that's going to give me good information about the system and let me know what's happening going forward. So that's really what this model tries to do. And so this is what the US model looks like. So I said that the National Children's Alliance set the standards, and part of those standards dictate who exactly has to be a part of the multidisciplinary team. And so for us, it's law enforcement, child protection, prosecution, medical, mental health, victim advocacy, CAC staff. And I put the forensic interviewer in there. It's not specific in the standard, but in the US, that role of forensic interviewer really has become such a specialist role. And we know so much more about that role than we did, back in the, early to mid 80s, that I think it's important to include that. It's pivotal. It's also, I think, a very difficult role for forensic interviewers. And so I think it's just worth calling out and what their role is on the multidisciplinary team. So, but the CAC model in the US, as I believe strongly in the CAC model internationally, it is customizable. It is to meet the needs of each community. And so there are multidisciplinary teams in the US. There are, like we said, 1,000 CACs. They may look 1,000 different ways, because at the core, it's what does this community need to do to respond to these issues, these child abuse cases. And so there are standards that are set by the National Children's Alliance, like I said, but they're minimal standards. And there are lots of ways to meet those standards. And so it really doesn't matter what level we're working on, whether we're working with a local CAC in Georgia, or we're working with the CACs of Texas, or we're working on the national stage or international stage. Our goal really is to help communities figure out how do they create this response that meets the needs of their community. And so what we're trying to do is really support solid investigations and prosecutions, and provide all of those support services that kids and family need, that provides hope and healing for kids and families. And so these teams work. I fully believe in that. I have worked with hundreds of teams over my career. I believe that they work. I also believe that they take a lot of work. It takes a lot of time and energy to really keep a multidisciplinary team or multi-agency team working together. And so somebody just said to me the other day They said, Karen, I think of you often because I can remember you saying we're just trying to help some children. It should not be this hard. Yes, I have been saying that for more than 20 years now. We're just trying to help some kids. Why is it so hard to just help some kids? But it is. And so when you look at what is a team, what's the definition of a team? A group of people who come together to achieve a common goal. Okay, so I'm just kind of interested, if you put something in the Q&A, what feels challenging about that when you think about what's challenging about a group of people or a number of agencies coming together to achieve a common goal, each with well-defined interdependent roles who have an identity as a team with a clearly defined function and who must interact with each other to achieve these shared objectives. Should be easy, right? Maybe, maybe not. And I really like this definition that I found, that it's a group of people who work together but can do their jobs. A group consists of people who work together but can do their jobs without one another. A team is a group of people who cannot do their jobs, at least not effectively, without the other members of their team. So multidisciplinary teams or multi-agency teams exist because there's not one agency that can meet all the needs of kids and families that we're serving. It just can't happen that way. And so that's why this approach is so important. But if you remember that common goal or that shared objectives that we're trying to reach, I mean, let's face it, these agencies have really competing agendas, right? So a forensic interviewer is walking into that forensic interviewing room and they're like, okay, what information can I get that is legally defensible while at the same time I'm caring for this kid? Law enforcement is trying to figure out, has a crime been committed? Is there a charge that I can make against an offender somewhere? Child Protective Services is always just about, is this child safe? I've got to determine, is the child safe? Can this child stay in their home? Do we need to remove this child from the home? Medical's really looking at, does this kid need medical care? We're going to talk about a little bit later. There's rarely actually, physical evidence that comes out of the medical exam for kids, but medical is a lot more than finding evidence. And it's really about, does this kid need care? The victim advocate is really looking at what does this family need from me? What does this family need from this community? How can we support this kid? And then mental health is really looking at, how do we help healing begin for this kid and this family? And part of the challenges with this is that, oh man, there's no test to really identify offenders, right? Rarely are there symptoms that specifically proves child sexual abuse. I don't know how many times I've heard a multidisciplinary team, or law enforcement or child protection saying, I just need the doctor to tell me, did abuse happen or not? It's just not that simple, right? Rarely are there any eyewitnesses to anything, rarely any medical evidence, and shame and fear on behalf of our kids make it really difficult for them to be able to disclose abuse. And there is still just such, at least in the US, I don't know what this looks like for you guys in Scotland, but this social stigma or repression of, conversation around sexual abuse. I once had a board of directors ask me to come and do a presentation on how to talk about child sexual abuse at a cocktail party. Because, and I can remember one time here at NCAC, we had a development person start in our development department, and they said, this is an easy sell. And I said, come back to me in 6 months and let me tell me if this is an easy sell or not. There is still a lack of wanting to really talk about child abuse and specifically child sexual abuse. And it's really, I think, harder to wrangle people to support the work that we're doing. And, not one single agency can address all of the things that need to happen in a case of child abuse. And quite honestly, a lot of people are interested in doing this work. How many of you have been out some before and somebody asks you, what do you do? And you say, and they say, ooh, I couldn't do that. I had a forensic interviewer tell me one time, she says, yeah, I just finally started telling people, yeah, I know you can't do this. There's something special about me. I can do this. But I think that that's true. And I used to have, judgment around folks that weren't willing to do this work or weren't even willing to talk about this work. But I've now come to understand and realize that, yeah, there are some people that just aren't cut out to hear and experience and help walk this road with kids and families that experienced abuse. And quite honestly, finding adequate training in this is really hard, right? Um, for the local law enforcement officer, I don't know what it looks like for you guys in Scotland, but in the US, child sexual abuse is not taught in law enforcement academy. How to do these investigations is not necessarily taught in law enforcement academy or anywhere. I have a master's in social work. I didn't have one single course or even lecture that talked about the impacts of child abuse. So we just don't get enough training around this. And then what we see happening in these multidisciplinary teams or these multi-agency teams is really just the tip of the iceberg. We see these behaviors that happen. Sometimes it looks like resistance. Sometimes it looks like people just don't care about kids as much as we do in the CAC world. But it's not true. There's so much more happening underneath the surface, just like with an iceberg. And so part of it has to do with what are the perceptions about the roles of MDT members or multi-agency team members? Do they really understand their role? I can remember one of my former colleagues, she was actually the director of, it's DHR, is our child welfare system in the state of Alabama. And she said she was just told to go to this meeting. So she goes to this meeting and it's an MDT meeting. She wasn't told why she was there, what her role was. She just showed up and it's like, what's going on here? And so we can't assume that these different agencies are correctly orienting MDT members about what their role is when they show up or they're participating in this. And then there are these competing agendas that we talked about. And then there is a matter of trust. When we ask a law enforcement investigator, they're actually turning over part of their investigation to this team of people that they may not know and that they may not trust, and they may not understand why everybody's there. All of these agencies have different cultures within those agencies. So I'm sure if y'all have ever worked with this, you see this play out in very real ways. And let's face it, like it or not, there are politics that are involved in this between these agencies and even within these agencies. I was a prosecutor one time. They were doing some training for us, and I was like, okay, help me understand this. I said, it seems like these are the hardest cases to prosecute. And she said, yes, they are the hardest cases to prosecute. And it's where we often put our youngest prosecutors with the least experience on these cases that are the hardest to prosecute. So these kind of politics involved. I know in the US, I had a law enforcement officer tell me one time that he got in trouble. And so as part of his punishment, he was put on the multidisciplinary team to investigate child abuse cases. At the same time, I heard from somebody from Australia one time that if you made it to work these child abuse cases, that was like the pinnacle of your career. They valued that so much. They had special terminology for it. They had special pins that you wore. So kind of what this looks like in the politics of each agency in each country differs, tremendously. And then expertise, again, child abuse is not necessarily taught in law enforcement academies. It's not taught in grad school. There's lots of places that they're learning about how to work these cases, oftentimes within this multi-agency response. Really what this model is supposed to look like differs tremendously too, because we don't always do as good a job as we need to orienting people to what it means to do this work this way. And then personal history. We've got some research that tells us that people who work in the helping professions have a higher rate of child abuse, have a higher rate of adverse childhood experiences than the general population. So we're all bringing this with us to this work. And then also your professional history and kind of what that looks like. And so if you ever get to come to Huntsville, we are the land of the space and rocket. We have the Space and Rocket Center. You can go to Space Camp and you can learn what it means to work in outer space. Really cool. My granddaughter got to do that recently. You will see this kind of thing. There are rockets like on street corners because Huntsville has been so much a part of the space industry and offensive and defensive weapon systems. As the U.S. has closed the military bases, they've moved a lot of that work to Huntsville. And so this is a very Southern phrase. So I'll introduce you to a very Southern phrase. You can't sling a dead cat without hitting a rocket scientist in Huntsville, Alabama. So slinging that dead cat, yes, is a phrase that we use in the South. It's true. I mean, everybody I know is either married to or is some sort of rocket scientist, including my own husband. But the truth is, what we do is a heck of a lot more challenging and more complex than what they do. Number one, they have millions and millions of dollars that are available to them for tests. I can remember one time my husband coming home and talking to me about some sort of wind tunnel test they were doing that was over $1 million. And I was like, you do realize that that the whole amount of money that the U.S. Gives to child abuse is a heck of a fraction, budget dust is what we call it, than what is applied to some of this stuff. And it's just more challenging and it's more complex. And so there are some real barriers to doing this work this way. And some of these are real barriers. I think some of these can be artificial barriers too. And so I don't know if you've heard this. It's really an ancient kind of parable about a group of blind people going to experience an elephant in a village. And somebody's, touching the ears and saying, wow, this is like just a big fan. Somebody's touching the tail and like, oh man, this is a rope. Somebody's touching one of the legs of the elephant and they're like, oh, this is like a big tree trunk. Somebody's touching the snout or whatever, what is it called? I don't even know now. But there's like, this is like a snake. And so is anybody wrong here? No, they're looking at this through the lens that how they're experiencing the elephant. It's the same thing for our multidisciplinary teams. They're bringing a different lens to a case. And guess what? We want them to do that. The goal of this model is not to turn law enforcement investigators into social workers that are like, how are you feeling about this? We want these different professionals bringing their expertise and their lens of how they look at things to these cases. But you also have to be open to, yes, they're bringing a different lens. We welcome that lens, but open to the other lenses that are around the table, because you don't get a full picture of the elephant until you're hearing from everybody and you're putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. And we are constantly balancing this agenda of getting the bad guy and helping the child. And as a social worker myself, who's worked in the CAC world for so long, I can't ever say that, it depends on a case by case basis how we're tipping those scales. I mean, we have some pretty horrendous cases of pedophiles who have, abused thousands of kids here in the States. And when you think about, are you helping the kid or are you getting the bad guy? It's almost on a case by case basis. We had a prosecutor here one time on a case here in Huntsville, and it actually made national news because the prosecutor decided to settle the case. And I was talking to her afterwards and I said, so, talk to me about it. Tell me what happened. And there were two boys, teenage boys, who were children at the time, teenagers by the time it went to trial. And they had been abused by their foster dad. And she said, when we got into court, those two kids were that she says, when that offender walked in, I could just see those two kids collapse in upon themselves. And she says, I just knew I didn't need to put them on the stand to testify in front of him. So it's this constant balancing of, what are we here to do? Are we helping the kid? Are we trying to get the bad guy? Because we know oftentimes when we're getting bad guys, like when you think of Jerry Sandusky, or we had a pediatrician in Delaware who was sexually abusing hundreds of kids over 20 years, who had groomed the entire community, which is the most important aspect of this. And I tell teams all the time, I wish I could just give you a handbook and say, you do 1, 2, 3, and this will work. It's not that simple. It's more complex for us. And the truth is that just the very act of doing this work, of walking this road with kids and families, it impacts us personally. And what we know is, we call it secondary trauma. What is traumatic for kids and families can also become traumatic for us. And when we're working from that space of being activated and in that kind of secondary traumatic stress space, it impacts our ability to work together collaboratively too. So oftentimes, I got really interested in secondary traumatic stress because I really thought maybe that was at the core of a lot of conflict that we saw on multidisciplinary teams. I'm still kind of convinced that's probably part of it, to be quite honest. But how this work impacts us as individuals, personally and professionally, can be profound. And we're not talking about that enough. And another challenge for us with these teams are that just when you get a multidisciplinary team or multi-agency team working well together, something's going to change. We have a lot of turnover on teams in the US, and I don't know what that looks like for you. We have workforce shortages in child protection. I mean, just tremendous workforce shortages. One of our forensic interviewers was telling me just last month that they have CPS, child protection workers, that come in. They don't even know how to create a safety plan for kids who've experienced abuse. So just when you think a team's working really, really well together, enjoy that for 15 minutes, because some change is coming, whether it's people rotating off, some policy change that happens in an agency that impacts the team. There's constant change going on with our teams. And this whole multidisciplinary thing, let's be honest, there are real true silos that impact our ability to share information. Some of those are real silos, some of those may be artificial silos, but it really is hard to get these agencies that, as we talked about, already have different competing agendas to be able to come together around a shared agenda. So these different politics that are happening within agencies, between agencies, different and ever-changing policies, procedures, timelines that we experience here, and really little or no control, in the US at least, over who is assigned to the multidisciplinary team. So it's not like if I'm the CAC and I'm coordinating the multidisciplinary team, it's not like the police chief is coming to me to say, who would you like to serve on the multidisciplinary team? No, it's just like, here's who you're getting. And so what we knew then, before there were CACs, and kind of what we knew now, we didn't know anything about child trauma in the 80s. We weren't talking about child trauma, much less researching child trauma. Now we have a whole body of research about children and trauma. We have evidence-based practices that we know how to help these kids if we can just get these kids into a CAC. We didn't know anything about how kids, disclose child sexual abuse or don't disclose sexual abuse. And now we have a whole body of research that tells us how to talk to kids about this in a way that's defensible. We didn't know anything about sex offenders and how they manipulate kids, families, and whole communities. And now we know a little bit more about that. And we know how to help these kids. And youth with problematic sexual behaviors, we weren't talking about that at all. And I don't know if this is universal or just in the US, but a third of child sexual abuse cases are perpetrated by adolescents. And you know what? We have evidence-based practices now that almost has that recidivism rate to 0. So we know how to help these kids now. It's like if kids go through this treatment, 5% recidivism rate. So we know so much more now than we did in the 80s. And it's just remarkable to me that we were so on point in the 80s. And then when we think about, I often hear from CAC staff who kind of take a high road around, we care more about kids than our multidisciplinary team partners. I don't know that that's necessarily true. But there can be individual sources of resistance. Law enforcement, like I said, they're turning over a part of their investigation to another group of individuals. And I can promise you their career advancement and their promotions aren't based on how they're working with their multidisciplinary team, more than likely. Lack of clarity about the roles of what is my role on this team. And then workload and resource concerns. Again, at least in the US, I assume this is happening globally. We don't have enough people in the workforce to actually do this work. And then these agendas that we talked about balancing. I'm an individual. I have my own agenda, my own personal career advancement, hopes and dreams. I have my agency that is putting certain criteria, certain expectations on me. And then I've got this multidisciplinary team that's putting different expectations on me. And the cultural differences between these agencies is pretty profound. So I'm going to end with just a couple of things here. So a few years ago at our conference, Kevin Mulcahy, he's a former federal prosecutor who's also a survivor of child sexual abuse. And he said, you do have a specialized skill set if you're working in a children's advocacy center. And just because it's true doesn't mean it's okay to say to kids. He says, don't say it happens to a lot of kids. He says, it's common for us. It's not common for victims and families. And so he talked about he was sexually abused by a soccer coach. And the abuse happened over a period of time, including the abuse happening kind of in public in this sleepover that was happening in a gymnasium, that everybody was in this big room in sleeping bags, and this person sexually abused him there within that. And one of the things that he talked about was that he doesn't remember the name of his first grade teacher, but he does remember the name of the law enforcement officer who walked him through this case. And this was before there were CACs, so he wasn't going through a CAC with this. But he also says, use your forensic interviewers. He says, don't offer, I believe you, unless asked. Because he said this law enforcement officer, who he still stays in touch with, by the way, said, I believe you. And he says, as someone who experiences this, it never dawned on me that if I actually disclosed, that would be questioned whether or not I was believed. And he says, you do not get to ask, did you get excited? He says, often the betrayal is greater than the sex act. So he said Randy was his offender. And he said, Randy broke his heart. He perverted the word love. And he said, I cared more about that hurt than actually what he did to my body. And he talked about in his story that at some point in time, the abuse started in a car in a parking lot at the soccer field. And he said, so at some other time, he saw Randy in a car with another kid. And so Kevin knew what was happening. And he said he felt betrayed by that. So I think that speaks to, and if you start, one of the great things about where we are as a field is that you do have more survivors talking about their experiences and what it felt like. And so I was listening to a podcast a couple of years ago that was about the Larry Nassar case with the U.S. gymnastics case, and you can hear the confusion that victims experience. Is this abuse? Is this not abuse? For the cases in the U.S. gymnastics, they're like, this is a doctor for the U.S. Olympic team. This can't be abuse, right? So, but you hear that, and I think this is what Kevin's saying, is that this is very complex, the way that kids and teens experience the abuse, and that their story continues long after the conviction. And I think the thing that spoke most to me is that it really is a privilege to be a part of a kid's and a family's story of their abuse. And so how are we honoring that? How are we bringing our very best self and our very best work to that? So I'm going to stop there. We have just over 10 minutes, and I'm curious if you have any questions.